Hi, guys and gals. So, today, just a few words about the beginning of the Bible. So, keep in mind that we have one of the most famous and impactful stories in all of Western civilization. In Genesis chapter 2 and 3, we have almost more than we can talk about in one class. So, I want to start first by asking you a question, and that is, what do you think creation is for us today? Now, when I say us, I'm generalizing. So, thinking about Western civilization or what people think throughout Western history and civilization. What is creation? So, in this context, most people, in fact, if you asked anyone on the street, they would probably tell you, even in the Bible, that creation is what we call ex nihilo, something out of nothing, or what I like to call the Harry Potter method. Basically, this idea or even assumption that people have, even if they do know a little bit about the Bible, they assume that creation in that sense is the poof method, that something comes from nothing. So if we follow that to its logical extreme within our culture and society, generally speaking, what's the greatest angst for most people? In other words, what is the undoing of creation? So collectively, there's a lot of angst about the undoing of creation. So the opposite of this would be nothingness. So if we think about just generally in Western civilization, most of the anxieties are based on the idea that creation is something out of nothing, because the reversal of that is nothingness. So you see all these films and media and all these stories that deal with this angst of nothingness. However, if we turn to the Bible and the ancient Near Eastern world, creation, the act of creation itself, is actually not something out of nothing. It is order out of disorder. So, for the ancient Near Eastern world, including the biblical creation stories, the emphasis is on ordering disorder or ordering chaos. So creation comes out of chaos. Now, it doesn't mean that the assumption is nothing was created by God in the beginning. It's just that the act of creating itself is ordering the disordered. It's actually putting things into its proper place and boundaries. So in the ancient world, or in the biblical world, the greatest anxiety was, of course, chaos. And we're going to see this theme over and over in this class. We're going to see it come back. In fact, chaos is even personified or animalified as Leviathan or the sea monster or other things, especially water, is highly symbolic of chaos. So keep that in mind as we go through this entire course, the symbolism of water, and that is of chaos. Okay, so let's go to Genesis briefly. In Genesis, we see in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Okay, what is the act of creating here? So actually it is the assumption that God's already starting with some material. Doesn't mean God isn't imagined to be the source of the whole universe, but the act of creating begins with separating. Really quick translation note. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, the earth was a formless void. Sometimes you will see the translation, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, period. Now the earth was a formless void. Now there's a huge difference in between those two translations, the comma and the period. Now, many early translations, including the King James, was based on the period. In the beginning, God created, poof, the heavens and the earth. And that's the source of much of our assumption in Western culture that the creation act in the Bible is ex nihilo. But it's actually not. In the Hebrew, it's based on a slight mistranslation, the way the vowels are added to the Hebrew letters. So, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'haaretz, in the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, then it describes the earth was a formless void, rather than the act of God just poof, the Harry Potter method created everything, and then goes on to describe. So keep that in mind. This is why I'm a bit of a translation obsessed person, because it really makes a huge difference. So, in the beginning of the creating act, the earth starts out as both formless, void, dark, and deep. All right, so keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that in just a second. All right, so if we think about this idea of the wind, and chapter in verse 2, the wind of God sweeping over the face of the waters, a better translation of that is actually to incubate the waters. Now, the reason I say this, again, we look at the original Hebrew, there is a word in Hebrew that this verb was unknown until relatively recently with the discovery of some tablets, what would be today Syria, ancient Ugaritic, which is a language that's the closest to ancient Hebrew. So we didn't know what this word was in ancient Hebrew, and so we had this idea that the wind was doing something, but we weren't quite exactly sure, so we did our best guess here. However, we know this word from the Ugaritic tablets means to brood. It's an ancient word, old English word. It's basically what a chicken does to eggs, hatches or broods, so incubates. So that's actually what the wind of God is doing to these primordial waters. So now keep in mind, in Hebrew, most Hebrew words have many versions and many translations. So when we say wind, the Hebrew word ruach can also mean the Spirit of God. So sometimes you'll see it translated either way. Either way, the Spirit or the breath or the wind from God is brooding. In other words, incubating this primordial water. It's just a crazy, amazing image. And out of that brooding, this is what comes: light, right? Darkness, and then the rest of the creation story. All right, couple notes just to keep a little bit of the comparative literature in mind. The authors of the Bible were using the literary discourse and images and language of their day. So there's a lot of evidence that they appropriated some of the imagery of other creation myths in their telling of the creation story. One example is from ancient Egypt. So if you're curious, you like the ancient world, check out the Hermopolis Cosmogony. It's basically a story of the creation of the universe from ancient Egypt. And it describes very much the same type of primordial ooze, what they call the Ogdoad, which is the dark, the deep, the water, and the void. In other words, the primordial substance of the cosmos is made of those four exact same characteristics, but in the Egyptian myth, they're actually gods, the Ogdoad. So see, if you're interested in that, to see how the biblical writers used the imagery and the language and the stories of their day to be able to tell their story as well. Okay, one last image here, just to take a look. The cosmology of, or the image of the cosmos in Genesis chapter 1 would have looked something like this. This is a little bit of the idea of the heavens. And I bring that up because in the first chapter, they do talk about separating the heavens. So there's a plate, and you can see this sometimes called a firmament, which is actually a made-up word from firmamentum in Latin, which was a translation of this word in Hebrew, which is basically there is a separation or a metal plate, a rakia, that separates the heavens. And I only point this out because it will come back later when we talk about the flood, because in this cosmology of the ancient biblical world, they viewed waters above that separation and waters below. So basically the rain and the water that we would encounter every day would be beneath the rakia, the plate or the separation, and then there are cosmic waters that are above that, and that's what actually floods the earth in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. So that gives you a little bit of a picture of how they look at the universe. Okay, so we won't go through the whole chapter, but I just wanted to read a little bit with you. Just Genesis chapter 1 verse 6 here. And God said, let there be a dome. Again, this is that rakia word, Hebrew word rakia, which is something metal, something that's beaten out by a metallurgist. So there's a dome in the midst of the waters, and it separates the waters from the waters. We just saw that image. God creates the dome and separates that. He calls the dome sky. And there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And then 9, and God said, let the waters under the sky be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear. So, and it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas, and God saw that it was good. So, note about creation here is that it is creation order out of disorder, and it's also extremely orderly, as you can see. It's based on separation, and it's based on separation through opposition. So things come into being by being separated from their opposite, right? And it's amazing. So think about this creation through separation, especially when we talk about gender later on, and that will come into play as well. So orderly, and it creates a picture of categories and things separated into their species and their categories. Okay, last but not least then, here's a nice little image that Martin Berry has put together of the 6 days of creation. So it's not coincidental. Everything is equally balanced, perfectly balanced. Verse 1, or day 1, is the creation of light and darkness. Day 2 is the separation of the water from the skies. And then day 3 is the separation of the earth from the sea. So we have these sort of separate categories, and then when we go to day 4, it equally balances day 1 in that God fills those spaces. So sun and moon and stars fill the 2 categories. And then day 5, God fills the sea with creatures and the sky with birds. And then day 6, God puts land creatures on the land and animals. So you can see that there's sort of a governance of the space in 1, 2, and 3. And then in days 4, 5, and 6, God sort of creates and fills those spaces, those things to govern those spaces. So it's beautifully balanced. It's perfectly organized. And all 6 days point to the day of perfection, which is day 7, the Sabbath. So we will see throughout the rest of the Bible that God is the author and the keeper of order. God maintains order, and that's a primary role for God throughout the Bible.